Well, welcome to our panel on cybersecurity governance. My name is John Carlson, and I'm the Senior Vice President at the American Bankers Association. I focus on cybersecurity, regulation, and resilience. I'm joined by an amazing panel of experts in cybersecurity, and what we wanted to do was to talk about cyber governance, and that covers a lot of different areas. So what we're going to do is go through a series of questions and ask our panelists their views on how they approach working with boards of directors, what kind of frameworks they use, how they're approaching issues like third-party risk management, incident response, cyber risk insurance, et cetera. Before we get started, I wanted to ask each of our panelists to give a quick overview of their backgrounds, their institutions, how they got into cyber, and then we'll jump right into a series of questions. So why don't we start with Susan first?
John, thank you for hosting this panel. Good day, everybody. My name is Susan Koski. I serve as the Chief Information Security Officer at PNC Financial Services. And I got into cybersecurity based on picking it because it was the thing I knew the least about and I wanted to learn. And it worked out to be a great career choice.
Very good. I'm Brian Fricke. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at City National Bank of Florida. We're considered a mid-sized bank. There's mid-sized, large, and other super large and systemically important banks, all in those tiers. And I've been at mid-sized and large banks. I did 5 years active duty Marines, 10 years in federal service, and the last 13 years in the financial services industry. I'd say what got me into it was just the curiosity, right? I leaned into it. My military career was aviation electronics, working on helicopters. That parlayed into technology things, which then parlayed into cybersecurity as it became a domain of warfare, air, land, sea, space. A domain of warfare was cyber, right? And I was right place, right time when the industry was changing, and I just kind of kept leaning into this space, and lo and behold, you wake up one day and you're the CISO. That's kind of how it goes sometimes.
Well, I should probably add my background too. So I got into cyber mainly from the regulatory agency side. So I worked at the Office of the Control of the Currency for a decade, and through a series of different initiatives and projects, I ended up writing some of the FFIEC's information security handbooks and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley safeguards rule. So I kind of approached it from the regulatory side, and then for the past 20 plus years, I've been more in the association world, a few stints in a large institution, Morgan Stanley, and then a few years at Amazon Web Services. So cyber's always been in the background, but it's really been focused on, how do you risk manage? How do you defend institutions from a lot of different adversaries that are out there? So great. So that's a great introduction. Clearly, you guys are qualified to talk about this topic. So my first question is about frameworks. And I'd like to hear, maybe start again with Susan first, talk a little bit about what kind of framework do you use? What's the frequency of your reporting to the board? How do you measure the maturity of your program? How do you determine what's material? How do you decide what gets reported in the regular board updates versus an incident or an escalation? So I'd really like to hear kind of your overarching approach to how you're framing it for your boards. Susan?
So relative to frameworks, one of the things we made a decision to do was, because there's so many out there, and we made a decision to join the Cyber Risk Institute and leverage the Financial Services Risk Profile, which has mapping to a number of different frameworks out in the industry. So we leverage that and we assess ourselves to that, and we report that on a regular basis to various constituencies, internal agencies, as well as the board, and showing where we are, and then also showing where we continue to make changes and or investments relative to that. So that's how we think about that. And then relative to the maturity of program, that's one way of looking at it. But for the different programs that we have, there's different industry standards out there, like one being the building security and maturity model for application security. So there's assessments against that. And other things as well. I always look at frameworks, though, as you've got to pick what works for you. And you have to pick and help people understand why that's the right one. But then you also have to be flexible enough that if there is something that comes out like the NIST risk management framework, that you're willing to kind of look at that too, because it may not always be mapped into the thing that you've decided to use. As far as materiality, that all goes through the appropriate processes relative to with our legal partners, et cetera, and what would be considered something that would be of that level to have that level of conversation. But something that needs to go to the right levels of executives, management, and board would follow that process.
How often are you getting in to talk to the boards about cybersecurity?
Typically, our board looks at cybersecurity on a quarterly basis, but it's always at the board's discretion too that if there's something they want to do interim or ask a question, that they're more than welcome to do that.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Same
Yeah.
question for you, Brian.
Well, I echo, what Susan, she's hit it spot on, of course, is that you have to tailor it for your organization's risk profile, the activities that you're undertaking. If you're not in the cloud, you may not have a bunch of cloud-focused controls, right, based on the CSA. So certainly, NIST CSF is a guiding light. The FIC handbooks, of course, articulate the specific control expectations that our regulators require. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act talks about protecting consumer data and being able to conduct control tests and understand the risk to consumer data and reporting annually to the board. There's a lot of very specific criteria in those. Then you can broaden the aperture and look at other programs like your access program, your application security program, cloud. So you're looking at OWASP and CSA and other frameworks of controls that are out there. Ultimately, I think the key is pull all of that into your control library and kind of synthesize that down into a control framework you're following. And then, as Susan mentioned, the mappings of your local controls to all those different requirements kind of makes your compliance burden a little lighter. But you're testing once and reporting across many frameworks, depending on who's asking, right? Is it a domestic regulator? Is it a foreign regulator? Is it your auditors, whoever? They all have a different kind of flavor or view. We have a parent company in a foreign country, so they ask about specific Chilean alignment. So every organization, you just need to think about what's my local framework, what's it based on, and how am I synthesizing all those requirements in. And then you talk about the alignment of cyber risk to the broader business, right? Strategic, operational, reputational, compliance, financial, those key buckets or key risk domains. That's really the art, right, behind what we do, is trying to translate access controls and cloud things and AppSec things and incident response and GRC things, translating all of that cyber risk and align it to the business in those SORCF categories. And then finally, I'll say that having your thresholds, those risk triggers, that when you begin to cross a trigger, it might trigger a materiality review. So you're bringing in legal, you're bringing in compliance, you're bringing in the CFO, right, or a delegate, and you're looking at a particular risk event or a particular aggregate of risks to determine if we've met a materiality threshold, where we now might have a duty to notify our investors, our regulators, other personnel, other groups or stakeholders, because we've reached that materiality threshold. The SEC says if it's material, notify us, but they're talking about investors. Regulators also say, hey, if it's a reportable event, let us know. So you need to have some sort of trigger to have additional reviews by the subject matter experts. You don't want the CISO making that decision all the time and being held accountable for the right or wrong way. Bring in your SMEs.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's a real team sport, within the organization. And Susan, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about kind of this public-private sector collaboration that your team at PNC has been playing a really significant leadership role. So this work began several years ago with the U.S. Treasury Department writing a paper on cloud computing and how financial institutions are migrating to the cloud, all the benefits associated with that, but also a lot of the challenges that institutions are facing as they're going on this cloud journey. And then more recently, focused on artificial intelligence, which clearly has a nexus to cloud computing because that's where the platforms are and the services are being offered from many of the major cloud service providers. So Susan, tell us a little bit more about kind of your role, your colleagues' role, about this whole Treasury effort, and what it really means in terms of your reporting to your board of directors.
So when you look at the work with U.S. Treasury, which is done through the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, and that's really the private part of it, and then there's the public part of it that comes together to work on these key initiatives. So relative to the paper that the U.S. Treasury wrote about cloud, we came together as an organization, industry organizations, to understand what are the key things that came out of that we need to address. So some of the things were around contract language, frameworks we use for maturity, the lexicon. What does this terminology mean? What does concentration risk look like? And then publish that really for the good of the sector. Not every financial institution may have numbers of people to work on those things. So at the end of the day, the goal is to really lift up the sector and have the sector not only have the right security, but the right resiliency and the cyber resiliency around that, as well as operational resiliency for the cloud. the cloud is here, people are adopting it and using it, software as a service providers are using it. So how do you collectively do that? And we brought so many different groups together, from the trades, from financial institutions, from public, and each group had key parts of the papers that they wrote, whether it was the public side, the private side, or even a joint collaborative, and then collectively also sharing that with the cloud service providers on expectations for the sector and how we want the cloud service providers to really help the sector have that security and resiliency built in. Because one of the other work streams was, how do we secure this by design so it's secured when it's turned on, and you have to make the decision to actually not be secure, and enable maybe smaller institutions to do that in a more simple and easy way. So that was that piece. And now with artificial intelligence, we're taking the very similar approach. It's going to be different SMEs, but this is around, how do you know that the intent of the model was the intent of the model? How do you know what the lexicon and the technology, things that you're talking about relative to artificial intelligence and Gen AI, everybody's using the same common taxonomy? And then in addition to that, how do you actually prove the model? And then how could these technologies be used relative to fraud and identity, which go so hand in hand together? And how do we as a sector really combat those? So that's the next large effort that is kicking off in the sector. But again, we have to work together. We have to collaborate together. Adversary teams are doing that. So us as a sector doing that is really important to the resiliency and security of the whole sector.
Great. And I'm curious, like, how have you talked about this with your boards? I know your CEO is playing a leadership role, and he's really, very significant player in this space. So I'm sure there's some interesting conversations with your board around all this work.
So we let the board know what we're working on. I think that, whether it's our executive committee or our board, there is a lot of support to partner with the industry, whether it's through PHYSIC or FSISAC, and the trade organizations like the ABA, Bank Policy Institute. So there's a lot of support for doing that, so we can really lift that up. And so we give a perspective on what we're doing, what the sector is doing, and how that helps everybody.
Great. Thanks, Susan.
I'll just add to that, I'm actually part of the Mid-Sized Bank Coalition of America. So there's a lot of different coalitions and groups that get together to share. And, the threat intelligence we share, the regulatory, kind of approaches we take to try to meeting regulatory expectations, the more we share, right? Because these aren't competitive edge things. These are, let's uplift the whole industry. Let's make sure that our system is safe and sound as a whole, right? And these are the kinds of things we want to be sharing back and forth. Again, threat intelligence, general control approaches to risks and controls, how we go about reporting, the right information to our boards and keeping them educated and helping facilitate their oversight function. All that comes into play. And so these sharing opportunities, that's why it's great to hear that, Susan and the team is leading the way there. No matter what industry vertical you're in, no matter what size you are, there's probably a group of people talking about how to do better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, artificial intelligence is everywhere. We hear it all the time. It's coming up in multiple contexts. How are you talking about, maybe this is to you, Brian, first, how are you talking about artificial intelligence in terms of the risks and the opportunities? Obviously, CISOs are really primarily focused on the risk side of it, but, cybersecurity is an enabler of doing business. So you really have an important seat at the table.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it all starts with education, right? If our lines of businesses don't understand it, if our boards don't understand it, our auditors, right? So that's one of the first steps we had to really take, is to not only learn ourselves this very emerging, very ever-changing kind of forefront of AI and its use cases and how it could affect us as an organization. We looked at it in sort of three lenses. There's the internal use cases, the things that we're going to do for ourselves, for our employees. I would say 1B is when you start to actually do consumer-facing things. That's a really bright line where you want to make sure you have good model risk management and you understand, how biases and explainability, and you want to make sure you can always justify and articulate how and why a particular AI use case is affecting a consumer. Then you have your current a suite of tools, right? That could be a Salesforce, it could be a ServiceNow, it could be, insert any number of tools. They're going to be implementing AI at the vendor level. So look at your understanding your tools and how these are going to be implemented there. And then of course externally, right? The bad guys, as well as the good guys, right? We're going to be trying to use AI to basically a bigger sword, bigger shield, right? It's a bigger shield, bigger sword. It's a bit of an arms race between the good guys and bad guys, and how we leverage these new tools to either conduct phishing attacks and other types of attacks, or malware reversal, and who does it the quickest, right? And who then can inoculate themselves and share that information across their stakeholder group to use that tool. That's all AI is. It's another tool to expedite and improve. And really, it's about productivity, whether you're a good guy or bad guy. So again, you've got the internal stuff, you've got the kind of third-party things, and then you have the external. And being able to articulate what those proper use cases are for us to invest in and leverage it, or where those risks are emerging, those top and emerging risks, and making sure that we're staying ahead of that curve as best we can.
As part of that education process, I'm really curious, what kind of questions do you get from board members about the risks associated with both cloud computing as well as increasing use of AI applications pretty much everywhere?
Right. Well, again, a lot of it was kind of not so much as like generally what is it. We have, our board members are sophisticated. They do read. They do try to keep up with what's happening. But the practical implications, like, right, how does it apply to our organization? I think that's the areas where they still are going to have to push in and talk to the CIO, the CISO, and understand that from just a cyber risk perspective. How much risk are we undertaking if we're going to implement these things, and understand its relation to the risk appetite that they've already set. Working with our second line of defense, our risk teams, to understand the use cases again, and have we done proper risk assessments for cloud use cases versus AI use cases, blockchain, right? All of these are just tools, and you have to treat them as such in the context of the way you apply them to processing consumer data, right, and providing those products and services.
If I could add to that, John, fundamentally, you have to have governance around how you're going to use these. And, you may be buying them, you may be building them. And what is it that you're going to say, yes, we're going to do this, and here's the intended purpose? And then how do you actually measure that the expected outcome is what you receive from that? So the governance piece needs to include the security team. Obviously, it's all about data, and then however your artificial intelligence team is structured. But as Brian said, it brings also the second line model risk management into it, but really making pragmatic decisions on what is something you're going to invest in that is something that's a benefit to the company or the customer. How do you govern that? And how do you know that your data essentially stays secure in those particular models and how you're using them? So I think a lot of companies are doing this, but they're taking a very measured, pragmatic approach to doing it so that there aren't unintended consequences, because everybody's learning about this technology and it's changing rapidly, probably even faster than Moore's law. So I think we've well outpaced that, and it's something we'll have to keep an eye on. I think the other thing too, Brian raised it, we as defenders and protectors have to use these kind of technologies as well and be just as aware of them to defend and protect our institutions, while making sure we're adhering to all of the appropriate data protection and model risk management governance and oversight. So I think you've got to bring the whole of that discussion to a board meeting. And as a CISO, you've got to be very aligned with your chief data officer, your AI officer, however your company's structured, and that they know you're there to be a partner to enable the business in a safe way. And then also, like, hey, if it's not going to get to that point of being safe, let's look at a different use case and see how we got there, and then build upon the successes that you have.
Yeah. Third-party risk management clearly is one of the biggest challenges I think CISOs are facing today, given that you're having breaches that occur at your third-party providers. How do you respond to those types of incidences? You've got issues around concentration risk and vendor lock-in. So I'm really curious to know how you're talking about third-party risk management with your boards. What are issues that get escalated? How do you frame things, in terms of the trade-offs and the risk exposure from using third parties, which clearly are essential for operating in this day and age? And let's maybe go to you, Brian, first, and then Susan.
Sure. We can't talk about third-party risk management in a vacuum. These vendors, these third parties, are providing services. They're providing business applications. Those support business processes, and those business processes deliver products and services. And if you don't have a good inventory and a linkage between the products and services you're offering, what those critical business processes are, the recovery time objectives, the dependencies that they may have on other areas, the business processes, linking them to the business applications, so you understand, again, criticality, and that driving your critical third-party inventories. If you haven't done that kind of legwork, it's difficult to manage. You'll be managing all of your third parties at the same level, and you need to kind of you have a striation. You want to tier them out. And then you get into what's important for that, based on what they're providing. And your SLAs with that provider, especially when it comes to availability, the SLAs need to be tied directly back to those business processes they support and the products you're delivering outwardly. It is difficult. They are starting to produce software bill of materials, SBOMs. That's sort of one of the newer kind of articulations or phraseologies around being able to say exactly what's in that particular application. I think that's going to be even more necessary as people start using AI in their applications, and even further, deeper understanding what model is their AI based on. Right? If they took DeepSeek, right, and created a whole AI function on top of DeepSeek, and that's what's actually been integrated into the product that you're purchasing, you need to know that. You need to understand where that data is flowing, how that's being used, if there's inherent biases in that model. So again, the relationship of AI into your third-party risk management program is ever increasing. I know that the audience, many of you probably are dealing with contract reviews and things like that. We've developed, like many organizations, an information security addendum, and it kind of articulates all those security things to help our legal team, our procurements teams understand what we're looking for up front. So when they have those initial negotiations, you can talk through it at an educated level, and then CISOs can step in and kind of redline and talk about the nuances. But you're right. Top to bottom, you've got to understand what you're buying, how it's been assembled. Again, open source software, AI models, things like that, and how you're going to manage that third party.
Right. And how, maybe drill down a little bit more in terms of how do you deal with incidences with your third parties, particularly those ones that affect multiple institutions.
So if they have a security incident, you're obviously concerned about the breach side of it. What was any of our information, in that breach? But there are security incidents, there are privacy incidents where they may accidentally send information to an unauthorized third party that's a little more minor. But it's the totality of their relationship, right? Are they meeting the SLAs? Are they having, do they have insecure practices, maybe, or real life risk events that have occurred that might make them even more risky? Do you put them on a watch list? What provisions are in your contract to hold them accountable for these types of degradations of service? Not just availability and outage issues, but also on the security, the privacy, the data handling side. And so it's the totality of those things that go into your third-party risk management program. And when you execute that successfully, then you have, I think, proper oversight and management. But if you aren't measuring those individual things and tracking them, it's very difficult then to show to your board, hey, I have this number of critical providers and everything's fine, right? Or, hey, we have these critical providers and these 4 or 5 are on a watch list because of some concerns we have, and that's an emerging risk that we're tracking.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Susan?
When you think about bringing the whole of the organization into really that board conversation, depending on your structure, it's how does security connect into the third-party risk management program? I actually ran one of those globally a couple of jobs ago. How do you, as the security team, connect into that? What are the kind of key security risks and issues? And then there's the operational resiliency piece of that too, for the critical business processes and what's working, what's not. And you may have that remit as a CISO or maybe a different organization, but really, how are you bringing that information forward? How are you explaining the shifts the program needs to make relative to maybe the inherent risk of the providers, where you need to dive deeper? And then I think the other thing too is around successes. So let's say a third party is saying they can't do something, and you look, and that maybe is a standard that's been out there for more than a minute. So our approach is to really call the third party, have the conversation, and say these are the expectations, and we really need to get your plan for this. And as we've done that, we've uncovered opportunities, but it ultimately lifts not only our sector up, but in some cases other sectors, when we mitigate some of those key items that previously maybe said, well, we can't do that. Well, let's talk about that. Let's understand how, explaining how you've had that conversation, the pivot, the change, and what's gone there. The other thing around third parties that I think is important is Are there any that trigger because if you're using like a security risk rating service, has any dropped below a threshold you may have established that requires a look? And then on incident response, not all third-party incidents are created equal, but what is that flow of third-party incidents? Is there anything that's risen to something that's a critical level that there needs to be a briefing on? And if not, right, there doesn't need to be a briefing. But then how are you tracking the metrics and the flows of are third-party incidents increasing, decreasing for your business? And then ultimately, too, I think there's an intelligence piece of the third party in explaining how you may be leveraging intelligence services, searching the deep dark web to see if your third parties have had an issue that maybe hasn't been reported to you yet. So you're actually engaging your incident response process a lot earlier than maybe the third party even coming to you and saying that they've had something happen. And showing how all of those things layer together and what that means and how really the control environment's been improved are the critical things. And again, partnering with your peer organizations that may be presenting to different committees, but that you're bringing the whole of that third party risk management process to bear when those conversations are happening.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of improvements in, I think, the monitoring side, like Security Scorecard and others who will provide that monitoring, and they'll actually do the vendor incident response kind of for you. So almost like MSSPs, how those have been around for a while, you're now seeing that those kinds of services available for third-party risk management, and that monitoring is key.
On the SBOM topic too, there's even some vendors out there that are indicating they're searching, right? They're searching, looking for different technologies companies may be using. Some companies may say, I use this vendor. It might be on a website, might be here. So there are some companies out there too that are really trying to, I'll say, gather that data and provide that. But that's ultimately really important because when you get to third party, fourth party, and even, flow downs from there, what are the technologies in use, at least to get you a jump start. So there's other companies out there that are indicating they're doing those things as well.
One of your favorite topics, I'm sure, is regulatory compliance. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what do you see as some of the challenges? I mean, how have regulators been ramping up their oversight of cybersecurity, third-party risk management, operational resilience? And more importantly, what sort of impact does it have in your cyber governance program in terms of what you're reporting, to your boards of directors? And maybe I'll go to Brian first and then Susan.
Sure. So, well, you were an author of the F5C handbooks in many ways. And so
sorry.
Well, I forgive you. But, I think a large part, there's some good and bad of it. On the good side, you have laid the groundwork, you've articulated the control structures that are expected of these organizations. The good and bad side of that, too, is there's some room for interpretation, right? And so while we might be able to say we interpret this regulation a certain way, regulatory expectations may be slightly different, right? Or they may want that nth degree of detail that we haven't yet considered because that's the stuff that you might learn as you go, or it comes from maybe industry best practice as opposed to maybe a specific handbook that we might be relying on. But I look at it in three groups. We want to keep the bad guys out. We want to make sure the data is available to the right people at the right time for the right purposes, right, internally. And on top of that, we want to make sure we're doing the right risk evaluations. We're doing proper cyber risk management and reporting to our board and doing all those things. By and large, if you're running your information security program and all of its sub-programs in unison or orchestrating that correctly, your compliance burden is far reduced because you're able to show that you're doing this activity and it aligns to these regulatory requirements. And that's what I mentioned at the outset about taking all those frameworks and all these requirements and synthesizing them into your own processes and into your own control library, so you have a cyclical review of alignment and that those are actually being done. ESPM, Enterprise Security Posture Management, is sort of a newer forefront, kind of a newer domain of tool types. And so that's another area where they're starting to make available, again, through all the APIs of all the different tools we have in our environment. They're able to pull in configuration control evidence, configuration data directly instead of bugging an engineer for maybe a screenshot of a control on a cyclical basis. And so that's a new area, tools like Digital X-Force and others, where they're just trying to help you show the compliance view, but also show that risk view within the same kind of dashboard. So we're seeing a lot of changes happening, I think, in the ways that we approach our regulatory compliance. But again, test once, report many. I think that's a really important approach that any organization can do. especially if you don't have an army of GRC, personnel.
Mhm. Great. Susan?
So from a regulatory perspective, the agencies, prudential agencies, really, they've got a tough job to do because they've got to kind of prove their work and prove that they've done the appropriate oversight as well. So I think that as new technologies come out, whether it's AI, quantum, you'll continue to see those questions come. And you will always see what I would call kind of the sustain and maintain questions. How are you handling third party risk? What changes are you making? And and this is where you need to really have a good internal view of those. Many of the agencies do publish kind of what their one in particular publishes a semi-annual risk report. John, you might have worked there. And they give you top of mind and what they're thinking about. So it's not really a surprise. And at the end of the day, they're really trying to make the sector better as well. So taking those, understanding what is top of mind, showing how your program is already aligned to that, or hey, this we heard you, here's what we're looking at next. And from that perspective with agencies as well, what is top of mind for them? How are you explaining that to the boards? But then how do you as a CISO, a risk function, have a regular cadence? Explain the strength of your program, what you're working on, transparency, so that ultimately we're kind of raising everything up relative to the discussions that we're having. And I think you're going to continue to see those kinds of focus because it's necessary in this day and age in what we live. Everything's built on software. Everything is dependent on each other. So now we have to really understand the great good of the sector and how we collectively address that. But again, I would just say look at the semi-annual risk reports, look at what's out there, and then make sure you're kind of addressing those questions. And when new guidance comes out, right, the FFIEC guidance doesn't get written just to get written. It gets written for a reason. Look at it, map your programs to it, make sure you understand it. The other thing too, I think that's also helpful, we get audited, in the information security function a lot, in this industry. So how can you have a ask once and use many? Brian kind of touched on this. Really almost like an audit locker. So this question came in from this source. This is how it was answered, but then that same information could be used multiple times. So it also helps more quickly answer the question and also really has a good effective use of the resources. So again, you're asking once and using many. And tying it back to the top when we start out with governance and frameworks, how this ties to your framework, how it ties to maturity, and how you're tagging that artifact goes to this piece of the framework.
Mm-hmm. Great.
One thing just to mention, I know, Susan, it's in the back of your mind too, is issues management. Self-identify the issues, have corrective action plans, set dates, right? By doing so, when the regulators do arrive, you can say, we know our warts, we know our problems, right? We know our control gaps, and here's how we've documented and reported those things. You'll be in a much better footing upon their arrival than saying, well, we know about it, and I sent an email. That will never be enough. You need to make sure you have a proper issues management function where you can submit them, track them, and resolve them.
I want to transition to talk a little bit about techniques in terms of how to communicate, with your boards of directors. I know from years ago, being involved in the FSISAC, that was one of the most popular topics. How do you speak to your boards? And there were people that were kind of champions of storytelling, others on, these color-coded, graphs and charts and things of that nature. What have you found to be the most effective ways of striking that kind of Goldilocks, just right balance that conveys the risk, does it in a way that's compelling to the boards, and you get clear kind of guidance from them in terms of, risk tolerance and whether or not they view you guys are doing an adequate job? So maybe you start with Brian first and then Susan.
Sure. So, there are a lot of different ways. I think a hallmark of a good CISO is to be able to articulate the complex, technical and esoteric cyber risk things into business speak, right? Being able to articulate how it affects the organization, where they should be focused on when you talk about top and emerging risks as opposed to the entirety of your InfoSec program. and then bite-sizing it as well. So I may bring a couple of topics from my maybe incident response or BCM programs or physical security, or in the next quarter or next following month, whatever it is, I may bring a different program to the forefront, so they understand throughout the year they'll have gotten little pieces of the effectiveness of the different programs that are operating within the entire InfoSec program. Then you get into more like metrics and how that drives maybe your RAG, right? Your RAG charts. Again, should be helping them highlight where to ask questions, where to look at things. All these, again, are tools to tell the story. Ultimately, us being able to draw all of this back to how it affects the business's strategic objectives, operational risk, reputational risk, financial risk, compliance risk, all those things. The better we get at that translation, the better our messaging is to the board. Final thing that I've done recently is to group all this cyber stuff into cyber assurance, cyber hygiene, and cyber resilience. And I'm trying to roll metrics and other program health into those 3 buckets. And I had an executive session with them. I explained to them how they would interpret this and how they could consume it. I gave them options across a couple different ways, and they liked those 3 buckets. They understood and kind of conceptualize around that. And that's probably the most important thing, is meet them where they're at. Talk to the board at the level that they understand. And of course, send them NACD articles, send them all kinds of educational things. But that informal communication with them really helps you frame how you can report these things in the long run.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Susan?
So you have to know your board. What are they looking for? What do they want? What are their backgrounds? None of these people are on a board because let me phrase it this way. They're all on a board because of their expertise, their prowess in the industry, what they've accomplished in their careers. So realize going in that they've already read all the materials. They know them. You don't repeat the materials. You make sure you kind of tell a story, or you bring in information that's additive to what's in the materials, whether those are PowerPoints or Word documents that have narratives in them. But bring that in, and really, you also have to kind of balance your message, but give the board time to ask questions. If you've got X minutes, don't assume you talk all those minutes. You leave, you give some color, and then you kind of leave the appropriate time to have those conversations. I also think graphics are important, right? They tell a story. Can a graph and a chart show the trend versus words? Do your materials have the so what? So if the reader is going to look at it quickly, or you have to get through something quickly, they can kind of get it from like the header and the subheader of the material and quickly understand that. So telling stories, but adding information about threats, or this just changed in the industry, here's why it's important, here's what you need to know. And again, leaving time for the questions and to have that engaging dialogue. I think as CISOs too, we actually have to cover the waterfront. So anything that can come up in those meetings could be any project potentially in the company. So you actually have to kind of go through all that and be prepared, soup to nuts on everything that's going on in the company. Because not only do we as CISOs have to sustain and maintain our own program and shift our program, we actually are here to support the rest of the company. And understanding what that rest of the company is bringing relative to security, or any security questions that could come up about projects, is really important. But I find storytelling and also leaving time for questions is really important, because again, these are very, very incredibly successful people. And you walk in with the assumption that they already know a lot, and you've got to add information into that.
Great. Terrific advice there. My last 2 questions are really kind of looking towards the future. One is, we're hearing a lot of concerns about the evolution of quantum computing, and that it could have a significant negative impact on encryption, that institutions rely for payments and secure storage and things of that nature. So how are you talking about these kinds of future risks like quantum computing with your boards? How do you prepare them? How do you get the right investments in order to mitigate some of these risks?
Few organizations are going to be, writing their own encryption algorithms, right? So really, the pressure needs to be from industry onto our vendor population to make sure that they're developing these quantum resilient, kind of NIST-aligned quantum resilient algorithms for future adoption. There's a terminology around crypto agility, and I think as the industry continues to evolve, especially on that cutting edge space of, oh no, what do we do with this quantum stuff, right? We have to continue to look at layers, right? What are the layers of protection? Do we have this do we now need another layer of kind of quantum resilience? Imagine like your VPN, right? Am I going to need a quantum VPN or some other, some quantum resilient VPN? So I think at each layer, wherever your data resides, we have to look at what those encryption algorithms that are being used, how they're being used, and continue to put pressure on, again, on our vendors to come up with those solutions so that the burden isn't on us as individual organizations to try to figure out how we're going to resolve it. We can lean on the providers.
So on quantum, right, I think there's a couple ways to think about this. There are different primers on the technology, right? Because we're operating at kind of that electron level. And what's the basic of a qubit? How does that work? So I think read aheads are helpful to kind of ground that. And then also, what are the things you need to take? What is your programmatic approach to being ready by when quantum supremacy hits, and when does it get here? So what is your approach to that? The inventory, the automation, the ability to be fast and be agile. And then how do you lean into the algorithms? But then also, how are your third parties doing that? Because that's a huge part of the ecosystem as well. And showing that you're on top of it, you know what's going on, and here's where you're moving next, and here's where you see the key gaps. Because this is things that I think we're all still learning about where this is going to go and how we need to be prepared for it. But again, it comes down to those kind of key things. You need to inventory, right? Kind of security 101. Got to know what you have to protect it. And then how are you quick and enable? I've heard people compare Y2K to when Q Day gets here. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think that we could still have traditional or classical kind of encryption that's broken, and you've got to be quick. So that goes to crypto agility. So crypto agility is a foundation of how you get prepared. So you can do those things quickly, and the more automation you have, the better off you're going to be. So that's why I don't like Y2K, because to me, Y2K, it was once and done. This is ongoing. It's something that's just going to continue, and it's going to get, if you think about encryption and the different ways that we do what we do today, right, that hasn't changed in a long time. This is fundamentally changing the way this works and way cryptography works. So explaining those terms in, again, a white paper, a pre-read, and then here's your plan, is really what I think the most effective way of doing that is. Because there's a lot of, different communications and I'll say technical jargon out there, but boiling it down to, this is what it means to us, this is what we're doing about it, and here's how we're going to address it.
And now I want to crystal ball a little bit here, kind of looking ahead 2 years. So in 2027, what do you think you and other CISOs are going to be raising with your boards as the top of mind security issues?
Certainly, I think we'll be much closer to Q Day. I think there's estimations around like 2030, and so I think that's when, 2027, 2028, you really, like Susan said, your inventory, understanding your risk profile as far as where you still might have some exposure, that's going to be important. I think AI is going to, think about AI, it's only a couple of years old in its modern context, and it's so democratized and available. I think that you're going to see continued lightweight models being run locally on your phone, on your endpoints, and where does that data go? Is it reaching out somewhere? I think there's going to be a much greater scrutiny on data flow, right? Okay, you have consumer data, it goes into a database, it's ending up on someone's laptop, they're now using Copilot or some other AI thing to interact with it. Where does that go? Is it going into the AI model to do crunching? Is that being processed locally? I think there's been a lot of scrutiny around that AI, XAI, explainable AI, or explainability side of how you're using it and where it's moving, and how things are being trained. So I think those are the right domains as far as AI, the quantum computing components, but it all comes down back to access, right? Do you have good access controls? Do you know who the roles, like the RBAC model, basically, right? Who is in your organization that should have access to what kinds of information? And we will move from more of a data-centric, data protection to knowledge as you have these AI models trained and fine-tuned, trained on your local information. So I think that it will shift away from just individual data access. It'll be, again, more knowledge-based, but that's just the importance of having those roles really well defined as far as what information they should be able to extract from a model. Or you're going to have multiple agents. I think agentic AI will also be at the forefront. So hopefully it's humans using multiple agents to accomplish things, and you're going to see a huge spike in productivity. So everyone out there, if you're not already learning about agentic AI and the ways to use those things to improve your processes and to automate the drudgery, now is the time. Every day is a fresh day to start learning and implementing and trying to understand the use cases, the practical implications to your organization.
Susan?
So I would say that you are always going to be talking about the threats. Are they manifesting as risks to you? What are you doing about them? And then incidents. And then always kind of grounded in GLBA requirements, as well as what you're doing for things that are disruptive capabilities. I think that's always going to need to be a consistent theme. For me, the critical thing I think for all of us is how are we being efficient and innovative in what we do. I kind of coined a term FOVation. I kind of put two words together. And how are we doing that to not only sustain what's expected, but to provide capacity for the future? And continuing to iterate over that, and how are we continuing to defend in a meaningful, more automated way and using technologies like Brian mentioned to do that. So I think we're going to be talking about how AI evolves, where quantum is going, but again, it needs to be grounded in, is that a threat to you? Does it manifest as a risk? And what kind of situation could it create for your company? And how are you handling that? So you may decide not to use certain AI items, which don't become a threat or a risk to your company. Quantum is going to apply to all of us. So I think you'll continue to see those things, and it'll always be centered around data and the protection of data as GLBA requires. And John, you well know that because you were one of the key authors there. And I just think as CISOs, we have to just stay grounded in the sustainment of the program, what we need to do, and then how we're addressing disruptive technologies. AI, quantum, et cetera, and making sure we're prepared for that. And I think the other thing too is how are we continuing to prepare for those who come after us? And how are we preparing our one downs, our two downs, giving them that exposure internally, wherever it might be, so that they're empowered to do those things, because no CISO can do this alone. It is, somebody said earlier, a team sport. And you have to rely on your team and your peers and the collectiveness of teams in order to do your job.
Great. Well, this has been a really good conversation. I want to thank both of you. I know we're almost out of time. I know when I'm on panels, I always forget to say something that I wanted to say. So, last call for any comments you may have missed that you wanted to convey.
I always like to plug, this is still a people business. Take care of your people. Make sure you understand or just be mindful of how we treat each other, right? We can get very caught up in the chaos, whether it be of putting out fires or regulatory pressures or business pressures. But take a breath. Don't let that stress and that chaos get inside you and really ruin your outlook on the world. And just remember, this is a people business after all. And then for us CISOs, it's on us to continue to groom and shape the workforce of the future. So I know we talk about there's not enough cyber workers, but I think there's lots of opportunities, lots of hungry folks out there that we need to bring into the fold and just give them those opportunities to learn and grow. And ultimately, again, be kind to each other. It's a people business.
I would just echo, don't go it alone. There are plenty of CISOs out there. If something's really, a tough item, someone else has probably already looked at that and solved that. So use your community, whether it's within this sector that Brian and I are part of or other sectors. Sometimes you find that there's different innovations in other sectors that you can bring to your sector, but have those connections. And again, don't go it alone. Because, sometimes the CISO does need a hug, and sometimes you have to get that hug from peers in the industry.
That's right. I'll be calling Susan for sure. So.
I will be calling Brian, too.
With that, we'll just give everyone a collective hug. And thank you both for a great conversation. I also want to thank Troy Leach and Jim Rebus at the Cloud Security Alliance for inviting us to speak and hosting this conference. So we hope you all have a great rest of your day and enjoy the summit. Thank you.